Sarah Grace. Good morning. Hi. You ready to go Bible class? Okay. Okay. I still got two items there. Beverly Smith, who was a circuit clerk here for many years, passed away, and her granddaughter is a friend of Sydney. So the family of Beverly Smith who passed, and then Sydney is with a group that's gone to Texas from the FFA club. They're going to be flying home as we speak, or close to it. Yeah, so I want to pray for their safe travels. Oh, did you? Oh, wow. Okay. All right. 8 house cats. Wow. Yes, Alan. Okay. Okay. All right. So Alan's continued issues with his discs in his back, uh, and not yet ready, not yet time for surgery, is what he's hearing. All right. Others this morning? How about this fall weather? Sure is nice. And we got some rain. We want to give thanks for that. I don't know if you need more, those of you who need some more rain, but we're thankful for what we got too. Yes, ma'am. Okay. All right. Alan and Karen are going to be traveling to Texas, leaving in the morning. All right, this is the last call. All right, Henry. pray for Jessica Dotson. Try to remember that when we pray again in worship hour. She's going to have a liver biopsy. She's been having some rapid weight loss. Jessica Dotson is the young lady that sits by Mary Jane on most Sundays. All right. I've been made aware of a couple more who need copies of the book. Those have been ordered. Amazon was having a big sale this past week, and that means some of the shipments have been slowed down. So I ordered these the first of last week, and they're still not in. But I do have some more copies coming. If you have not made me aware, or Frank made me aware, so if you have not made me or Frank aware that you need a copy, let me know. I'm still happy to order these for you. I think they're worth our while. And we are in chapter 3. We've been taking each chapter across the course of 2 weeks, and we're in the latter half of chapter 3 this morning. The idea of this book is that we are seeking in churches of Christ to be churches locally following the pattern of the New Testament. And in this chapter, chapter 3, we're talking about our worship in song. And the first half of the chapter is a historical overview of quote-unquote Christian worship. That is, how have people who call themselves Christians worshiped throughout history? And so we looked and spent time last week talking about this. And I freely admit that I'm not a historian, so much of what we read in the book is about as much as I know. I've done a little bit of digging, but not a lot. And he's going to bring up at the end of the chapter something we'll talk about later, this book called Old Light on New Worship, which also does a lot of talking about the history of the way that people are worshiping. And I have read most of this book. It is a library book here, so if you have an interest in it, it's available in our church library. But we talked about the history, and essentially what we said is for a very long time, people who called themselves Christians did not use instruments. And there were a number of reasons for that. We talked about the connection first to the Jewish worship, that Christians set themselves apart from Jews in part in the way that they worshiped. And then we also talked about during the time of the Protestant Reformation that these individuals who maybe were raised in the Catholic Church but were examining everything that the Catholic Church did and looking at whether or not the Catholic Church was following Scripture, began to go back to a time when Christians worshiped without instruments. And so, and then we also talked about there at the end of last week's class that there are some major religious groups today that do not use instruments, not just the churches of Christ. Most Eastern Orthodox churches, whether you're talking Greek Orthodox or Russian Orthodox or what have you, typically have not used instruments. And that goes all the way back to a split in the 11th century. And there's some historical stuff there that we're not going to get into in terms of why that split took place. But those in that tradition have traditionally not used instruments. And so that's just a very, very brief summary of the historical overview that we looked at last week. And we discussed last week, is history in and of itself, even of people who call themselves Christian, is that history binding for us, or does it establish a pattern we should follow? Frank? Okay, so Frank says if it's in the New Testament, yes, it's a pattern. If it's what's happening after the New Testament and not from the New Testament, then no, it's not something that we're required to follow. So we can say, hey, we're grateful for certain aspects of the history of people who call themselves Christian. We can learn from that, but is that establishing what we should or should not do? Not necessarily. He says, is there a difference between binding and pattern? I believe if we have a pattern, well, okay, perhaps. All right, so, yes. Okay, So I would say if the pattern is in the New Testament, it's more than a suggestion. But Alan asked, is there a distinction or a difference between binding and pattern? So I would say that if the pattern is in the New Testament and it's based upon the authority of God, it's more than a suggestion. It is required. But if the pattern is outside of the New Testament, it could be a suggestion. Okay? So is a pattern binding? Well, I guess it depends on the source of the pattern would be my answer, if that makes sense. I hope that's not, I'm not trying to be difficult, but define my terms, yes. So we can learn from history. We can learn from the practices of those who call themselves Christians throughout history. That does not necessarily mean that we're required to follow them in every way. However, in the New Testament, if we see something occurring in a pattern-like fashion, we believe that's by God's design. And if it's by God's design, then it is required for us. And so that sort of leads us into today's discussion. The latter half of the chapter really is an overview of the history of worship in the Bible, not in time since the writing of the Bible. I want to address two things that are not mentioned directly in the book, but that you will often hear, because we're about to talk about worship in the Old Testament and then worship in the New Testament. And I think we can all agree, does worship look different in the Old Testament from how it looks in the New Testament? All right, we all agree with that. I think any person in this discussion is going to be able to agree that worship has a different appearance in the Old Testament than it does in the New Testament. So you'll hear two statements that are being made from time to time. One statement is that because there are instruments in the Old Testament, then as people who follow the New Testament, it is fine and acceptable and good for us to use them. All right, we will talk about that in what we're going to look at this morning. The other statement that you may have heard, I don't know if you would have heard it in recent times, but if you go back in the history of churches of Christ in this country, it used to be relatively common for people to debate the use of instruments and other issues. We don't see public debates in the forums where they used to exist. These were like gospel meetings. They would be scheduled ahead of time. People would make plans. They would attend for both sides. There would be moderators, all these things. You don't see a lot of that. But from time to time, you might have heard, if you remember those times, people making the statement that God never commanded instruments, that he was never happy with instruments. And they'll cite a prophecy that talks about David making instruments and try to say that God never... That statement is false, as we will also see this morning, and does not help with the discussion. All right, so what we're going to do in following the chapter, beginning around page 80, is to consider in order the way that worship is discussed in the Old Testament. So we'll start with the tabernacle, and then the temple, and then the rebuilding of the temple in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. Now you'll notice he does not discuss worship before the tabernacle. Do you know why he does not discuss worship before the tabernacle? What do you know? Let me phrase a different question. What do you know about worship in the Old Testament before the tabernacle is constructed? It's not a trick question, I promise. Okay, so you had Cain and Abel who made sacrifices. You had Abraham who made sacrifices, and Isaac and Jacob. Okay, sometimes it's referred to as the patriarchal age. If you've ever heard the distinction of the patriarchal, the Mosaic, and the Christian age, this is what we would call the patriarchal. The reason he doesn't discuss it is, while we do have some few examples of making sacrifices before the construction of the tabernacle, we have almost no examples of any other form of worship, whether it's singing, playing instruments, etc. Okay? And we would even say, and I want to be careful here, but the examples we do have in what's sometimes called the patriarchal time, are all individual. So you don't ever see, before the construction of the tabernacle, a gathering of people that are assembled for the purpose of praising God. So what are we talking about? When we talk about worship, are we talking about what you can do in your house on Monday afternoon? Is that the nature of our discussion this morning? No, the nature of our discussion is what can we do as the people of God when we assemble on the first day of the week? We don't find an assembly for worship before the tabernacle exists. Does that make sense? Well, I'll give one exception. When God leads the children of Israel out of Egypt, just before they received the law of Moses, there's a celebration, and Miriam has a tambourine. Okay, so this is right before God gives instructions. Okay, but before that, so I say you don't find any other. I can't recall any other. If you can, correct me. Okay, Frank. Well, okay, so the Passover is established in Egypt, and they celebrate the Passover before the full law is revealed. Okay, I see what you mean there. Yeah, but even that is not the full assembly. Those are assembled in homes by family. Okay. All right. So first is this tabernacle worship. We're on page 80 and 81 as we think about tabernacle worship. And I want you to see this. If you've got a copy of the book, if you haven't, this is a quotation from Numbers 10 on page 81. We're going to read the full paragraph. When it came to the use of instruments in tabernacle worship, God specifically told Moses what instruments to use, who could use them, and when they were to be used. And this is the quotation from Numbers 10, verses 1, 2, 8, and 10. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Make 2 silver trumpets. Of hammered work you shall make them, and you shall use them for summoning the congregation and for breaking camp. And the sons of Aaron, the priests, shall blow the trumpets. On the day of your gladness also, and at your appointed feast, and at the beginning of your months, you shall blow the trumpets over your burnt offerings and over the sacrifices of your peace offerings. They shall be a reminder of you before your God. I am the Lord your God." Now, what do you notice about that quotation? Anything at all? Yeah. So there's a level of detail, isn't there? And we can say that when a person gives you instructions, if they give you details, those details do what? They matter. They not only tell you what to do, they rule out, right? They also are, this is what you're supposed to do and not something else, right? The more specific, this is just good linguistic rule, right? The more specific I am or you are in conversation, the reason for that specificity is to rule out other options, right? Okay, and so you can see God, as Chambers mentions, God specifically told Moses what instruments to use, who could use them, and when they were to be used. So did God leave a room for innovation or improvisation? Yeah, okay. Now, I'm not quibbling, but I would say even when you look at the first reference to the use of instruments, it's for summoning. I wouldn't even necessarily say that's worship. That'd be like ringing a bell to end Bible class, right? That's not even, but as he goes on, he says, you're going to take those same instruments played by those same people, and you're going to play them at the offering. But even there, this looks more to me like a marker of what's happening than it is playing of the instrument for the purpose of expressing some praise to God. Does that make sense? Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Let's go back and look. So it says, on the day of your gladness also and at your appointed feast. So I think that is any time that they're celebrating something from God, right? Okay, so if they make sacrifices, which they do, like you can bring a thank offering on any day of the week. So if you bring that thank offering, then this is the way that it's to be offered. Does that make sense? All right, so everybody understand what the tabernacle is? I sort of jumped over that. Does everybody understand what the tabernacle is and what its place is in the history of God's people? God gave instructions in the law of Moses for the construction of a tent that traveled with the children of Israel during the Exodus and the wilderness wandering. And that tent was the place where God's presence was said to dwell. It was very ornate. The Ark of the Covenant was there. It was the precursor to the temple. It did. So it came to rest at Shiloh. And you remember Samuel, he grew up in the tabernacle. And it's sometimes referred to as the temple, but we understand it's the tabernacle set in one place. Because the temple, made of more permanent structure, is going to come in the time of Solomon. All right, so we're going to, for the sake of time, we're going to move on to temple worship, which starts at the bottom of page 81. And let's think about what we see here with temple worship. You've got a couple of block quotes on page 82. If I've got somebody who would like to read, feels comfortable reading, I'll take a reader for 1 Chronicles 16, 4 through 6. It's printed in the book on page 82. Go ahead, Karen. Shamir Mott. Good job with those names. They're tough. Good job with those. So you see a couple of things here. Do you see a difference between this listing and what we read just a few moments ago for the tabernacle? Yeah, there's a difference. Okay. Do you see some similarities? What similarities do you see? Say again. The priests are blowing the trumpets. All right. As in the first list, are specific instruments given? Are the specific people who are to play them given? But I want you to also notice something, and this is something that's pointed out by Chambers. Who is the one who gave the instructions for these? David. All right. Now, if we only had this verse and said, well, David introduced instruments. Now, he was God's chosen king, but he's not a priest. He is in the New Testament called a prophet. But it's only when we get over to 2 Chronicles 29 that we're going to find out, and this is quoted on page 83. You can see it if you've got a copy of the book in bold and italics. David gave these, but he received them from God. Okay? So I want you to see the second quotation. It doesn't have any difficult names, so I'll take another volunteer. Somebody's bold. Same page as Karen read from. This is 1 Chronicles 23, 1 through 5. Go ahead, Frank. All right, so again, we've got David. Now remember that the chronicler is a historian. So he covers a huge period of history. And so you have 1st and 2nd Chronicles writing about things that in many cases happened well before he was alive. So we believe that he's led by God, so his knowledge is accurate, and he probably had access to some of the records that we don't have. But again, David is responsible for establishing what worship is going to look like in the temple. God does not allow him to construct that temple. Solomon does it. But he does allow David to live and provide for, in many ways, what the temple is going to look like. David makes huge financial contributions before he dies for the construction of the temple. He's also giving instruction for what worship is going to look like in the temple. And again, if we only had these verses, we might say, well, David came up with this on his own. He even says, the instruments I have made for praise. Okay? But it's the quotation that's given on page 83 from 2 Chronicles 29. This is during the days of Hezekiah. And Hezekiah is one of the kings who helps to return God's people to the standard. During the time of Hezekiah, he stationed the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals, harps, and lyres. Seen that listing before? It's the same listing we read from 1 Chronicles 16. Cymbals, harps, and lyres, according to the commandment of David. But where was that commandment from? The commandment was from the Lord through his prophets. All right, so what instruments were used in the tabernacle were used according to God's command. What instruments were used in the temple were used according to God's command. And again, we have another quotation at the bottom of page 83. David gave Solomon his son the plan of all of these elements of the temple. And it says, if you're on page 84, and the treasuries for the dedicated gifts, for the division of the priests and the Levites, all the work of the service in the house of the Lord, all this he made clear in writing from the hand of the Lord, all the work to be done according to the plan. So the plans that David gave for the temple came from God. Why does that matter? Frank? Okay. There's no such corresponding instruction or command in the New Testament. What else, Alan? Yep, the Lord was very specific in the way that he wanted worship to be done. Now, we're going to get into the New Testament in just a moment. We do see some changes, don't we? We acknowledged before we started this discussion that Old Testament worship and New Testament worship do not appear the same. And we understand, we have passages that say that we're not under law, but under grace in some of these. So, well, maybe God was specific in the Old Testament, but maybe he's given us freedom in the New Testament. We'll talk about it. All right, so again, there's another quote on the bottom of page 84. For the sake of time, I think we need to move on. All right. When you get on to page 86, there's a brief discussion of the time of the rebuilding of the temple. And again, for the sake of time, it's probably best if we don't read all of these quotations. But one is from Ezra and the other is from Nehemiah. And basically what you can see, and I hope if you haven't already read, that you can go back and look, is that when Ezra and Nehemiah participate in the rebuilding. Now, remember, we've talked about this before in this class. Ezra and Nehemiah came out of Babylon. God's people are in captivity for approximately 70 years. Ezra and Nehemiah are part of the waves of people that come from Babylon back to Jerusalem. They rebuild the temple. They rebuild the city wall. They reestablish God's people by his leading in the promised land. And in the constructing of the temple and in seeking to follow God's commands in the law of Moses as they had done before, they follow the details that were given, and the details line up again. And they were very careful that they followed the same instructions that were given before. So that's Old Testament worship. Really quickly, really briefly in discussion. God is detailed. He is specific about what instruments are to be used, who is allowed to use them, and even when they are to be played. All right? Now let's go to the New Testament. All right? So, is New Testament worship, I'm going to use a word, regulated? What do we mean by regulated? Is New Testament worship regulated? In the Bible, in the New Testament, are there any commands given for worship? Can I say it that way? Are there any rules laid down in the New Testament for the way we worship? I saw somebody shaking their head no, and I saw somebody shaking their head yes. Okay. So Alan says not directly that he's aware of. New Testament worship has the element of preaching. Henry? How about partaking of the Lord's Supper? Is there a pattern given? Are there instructions given for how to partake of the Lord's Supper? Jesus gave instructions. So he ate the Passover, but in eating the Passover, he identified two specific elements, didn't he? Right? There's specific instruments given in the Old Testament. Jesus says, here's the bread, it represents my body. Here's the fruit of the vine, it represents my blood of the new covenant. Right? Now, that new covenant is really important. That means God has a new agreement on how he's going to interact with his people. Jesus brings that about. We'll talk about that more in the worship hour. When we're supposed to take it. So, and this is where we get into something that we may have to discuss more before the class is over, but may not be able to discuss fully today. And that is, we know we take the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week because Acts chapter 20 and verse 7 says, when the Christians came together on the first day of the week, they broke bread. So we don't have any other example of Christians partaking of the Lord's Supper on any other day of the week. And we know that they took it every time they came together on the first day of the week. So that is where we use an example as a command, and that's something that we probably do need to discuss more before the class is over, and you'll have to forgive my failure to remember how much he talks about that. The Lord's Day and the Lord's Supper is the next chapter, so I think we'll get to discuss that some. Alan? Yes. Yeah. Well, he says as often as you eat. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. As often. Yeah. Okay. As often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, yeah, do this in remembrance of me. Right. So, what else? There are other commands given. Does Paul make any commands about the preaching that takes place in the assemblies in the New Testament? All right, Jesus says worship in spirit and truth, John 4:24, right? Do all things decently and in order. This is the case in all the churches. I do not permit a woman to teach. That's a command. All right, so there's a quotation on the bottom of page 88 from 1 Corinthians 14, and he cites, before the quotation, he cites that Paul is addressing rules for speaking in the assembly because of the disorder that existed in Corinth. He says, if anyone thinks that he is a prophet or spiritual, he should acknowledge that the things I am writing to you are what? A command of the Lord. If anyone does not recognize this, he is not recognized. So the things that Paul says about worship in 1 Corinthians 14 are not merely suggestions. They're not merely Paul's opinion on what worship should look like. He is giving commands for the worship assembly, and those commands come from God. Right? So, yes, New Testament worship is regulated by God. There are rules from God for New Testament worship. Are they the same rules as we find in the Old Testament? Well, obviously not, because we're under two different covenants. All right, and so if you look here, I thought this was a really good paragraph on page 89. Starts with the words, as the church fathers. As the church fathers, reformers, and Puritans scoured the pages of the New Testament, they found commands to sing praises to God. Ephesians 5:19, Colossians 3:16, and James 5:13. They found examples of believers praising him in song. Acts 16:25, 1 Corinthians 14:50. But they couldn't find even a hint of an instrument in worship. And then he cites a quote from LaGard Smith's book, The Cultural Church, in which he says, in contrast to the many Old Testament passages referring to musical instruments in temple worship, in the New Testament text, not one sound of a musical instrument is heard, not a trumpet, a harp, the quietest jingle of a tambourine. Singing, yes. Musical instruments, no. Relative to musical instruments, there is only an ominous, haunting silence. All right, so I think the basic argument is this. God has commanded his people to sing. I think that anybody can see that in the New Testament. The passages that were just cited, Colossians 3:16, Ephesians 5:19, James 5:13, God has commanded his people to sing. And at least grammatically speaking, he actually has given a specific instrument in Ephesians 5:19. Now, you're going to get this wrong. What instrument does God specify in Ephesians 5:19? Nope. Okay, so there's the voice. I told you you would get it wrong. I warned you. He says that you are to sing with your heart. All right? Now, singing implies voice, right? An instrument can be said to sing, but the word sing means to use your voice. So it was sort of a trick question, and I gave you a heads up that it would be. Right? But Paul says, sing with your heart, making melody in your heart to the Lord. Okay? So, if God has told us to sing, are we going to be wrong to sing? No. Now, that doesn't directly address whether or not instruments are present. But if in the Old Testament instruments existed only by the command of God, and only people who played them were commanded by God, specified by God, and the timing of playing them was specified by God, should we not expect that if he desired them in the New Covenant, that in the New Covenant he also would have designated how they were to be and what they were to be? Does that make sense? Now, from a logical standpoint, silence is not always your friend. It's always dangerous in terms of logic to make an argument from silence. You may have heard that before. But this is not an argument from silence pulled out of context. This is an argument from silence in light of the very loud instructions that we have in the Old Testament. Does that make sense to everyone? If the Old Testament had instruments, but we didn't know where they came from, or the Old Testament didn't say anything for or against instruments, I think we would be in a different place in our study of the New Testament. But because God was very clear when instruments were being used that he designated them and commanded them, and then he didn't, that is much more significant than if we just had the New Testament and there was no Old Testament. We probably would be adding instruments. We probably wouldn't be talking about it. Does that make sense to everyone? It's in the light of the way that it's handled in the Old Testament that we think about it the way we do in the New Testament. Yes, Lisa? Yes, that's right. She said he's giving guidance by omission of instruction. That specificity that we talked about, by specifying the voice and the heart. And again, this is something that doesn't get brought out too much in this chapter. When singing is talked about in the New Testament, part of its purpose is teaching. Can an instrument teach? An instrument doesn't give intelligible sounds, so to speak. All right. So we can go on and on. We're not going to talk about it because we ran out of time. But he mentions a neat story about the way this book came into being, Old Light on New Worship. You can see it in the book there. But basically, some Reformed Baptists heard that another congregation had added to their piano some other instruments, and they said, let's take a look at this. We just have a piano. And they came to the conclusion that instead of adding to the piano, they needed to take it out of the building. And this book is how they got there. So if you're interested, it's written by someone who's not a member of the Church of Christ, arguing for a cappella only worship. All right. And it's in the church library. Coffee and donuts downstairs. We'll be back at 11 for worship. And we'll start chapter 4 next week, Lord willing. Thank you all.